Something rather strange is happening in many gardens. We spend money buying leafy greens, we spend money on supplements, we spend time searching for foods advertised as being good for our health, but then we step into the backyard and pull out plants that humans once used as food for hundreds, even thousands of years. Some grow in the middle of the lawn, some appear in cracks between paving stones, some push up between rows of vegetables that we are carefully tending, and because they appear without being invited, we call them weeds. But plants do not change their nutritional composition simply because humans change what they call them. What makes today's list especially interesting is that many of these plants contain alpha-linolenic acid, or ALA, the most common form of omega-3 found in plants. ALA is not exactly the same as the EPA and DHA found in fish. The body can use ALA directly and convert some of it into longer chain forms of omega-3, but that conversion is relatively limited. So think of these wild greens as an interesting way to add variety to the diet, not as a replacement for fish, medication, or any medical guidance you may be following. And there is an even more important rule. Do not eat a wild plant simply because it looks like one you saw in this video. Identify it correctly and avoid plants growing in areas treated with herbicides or pesticides, polluted ground, or along heavily trafficked roads. Because the value of a plant only matters when you know for certain what you are harvesting. With that in mind, we begin with number 15. And the closer we get to number 1, the more these so-called weeds may make you wonder. How many times have we thrown away food without even realizing it? Number 15, ground ivy, creeping Charlie. If you have ever tried to keep a lawn perfectly uniform, you probably understand why ground ivy can test a gardener's patience. You may pull up a section in the morning and think you have solved the problem, but if just a few small pieces remain rooted close to the soil, the plant can continue spreading into the surrounding gaps. Its habit of creeping horizontally, rooting at multiple points, and gradually forming dense green patches is exactly what gave it the name Creeping Charlie. To someone who wants a lawn made up of nothing but uniform grass, that is an annoying trait. But if you look at the same ability from the perspective of survival, you see an extremely efficient plant. It does not wait to be sown. It does not require a carefully prepared garden bed, and it does not need a full season of attention from you. What is surprising is that ground ivy is not completely unfamiliar to the kitchen. In Europe, it was once used as a culinary herb, and analyses of its fatty acid composition have also found alpha-linolenic acid, or ALA, at notable levels in the lipid portion of the leaves. That does not turn ground ivy into a competitor to flaxseed or fatty fish. Its leaves still contain very little total fat, but within that small amount of fat, plant-based omega-3 occupies a meaningful position, making this plant far more interesting than the image of a creeping weed that deserves nothing more than to be pulled from the lawn. The way it is used also reflects the nature of the plant. Ground ivy has a pronounced aroma and a slightly bitter, fairly strong flavor, so it is not something you would normally treat like lettuce and pile into a large bowl. It makes more sense as an herb. A small amount of young leaves can be finely chopped into egg dishes, potatoes, soups, or mixed with milder greens. You can still control it if you do not want it taking over the yard. But that is very different from assuming it has no value at all. Right here at number 15, we already encounter the first paradox. The very ability to grow too easily is what makes a plant a weed, while under different circumstances, that same ability could be considered an advantage in a food plant. Number 14, wild violet. Wild violet has a completely different problem. People often notice it, but they notice the wrong part. Every spring, small purple, bluish purple, or white flowers emerge from the lawn. They are attractive enough that many people temporarily stop thinking of the plant as a weed. Some take pictures, others leave the flowers for a few extra days, but once mowing season begins, both flowers and leaves usually disappear together. The interesting part is that if we focus only on the flowers, we may be overlooking the part that matters more to today's subject. The heart-shaped leaves of wild violet contain ALA, and in studied species of viola, alpha-linolenic acid often appears prominently in the fatty acid profile of the leaf tissue. At the same time, violet leaves also provide vitamin C and other natural compounds commonly found in edible wild greens. It is this combination that makes wild violet interesting. It is not an oily food, nor does it need to be. Its value lies in the fact that a leaf with very little total fat can still devote a significant share of its fatty acids to ALA while providing completely different nutrients in the same food. In terms of flavor, wild violet is relatively approachable compared with many plants on this list. Young leaves of edible species can be mixed into salads or added to soups, while the flowers are often the easiest starting point for anyone new to wild plants because they are visually appealing and mild in flavor. But beauty is not an identification tool. You should never see a purple flower and automatically assume the plant is edible. The species must be correctly identified before use. Wild violet attracts our attention because of its beauty. But if we keep only the flower in mind and ignore the leaf, we may be looking at the right plant while paying attention to the wrong part. Number 13, cleavers. If ground ivy spreads by creeping along the ground, cleavers uses a much more ingenious strategy. It turns humans and animals into transportation. Walk through a patch of cleavers in spring and you may notice the stems, leaves, or small fruits clinging to your clothing. A dog running through the same area can carry them farther away. As we move, the plant moves with us. And through this simple hitchhiking strategy, cleavers has spread over wide areas for far longer than humans have understood the concept of ecology. That is why the most common memory people have of cleavers is usually having to pull it off trousers or socks after a walk. Yet in European traditions of using wild plants, cleavers was viewed very differently. The young spring growth was harvested and used in various ways, particularly as a cold infusion. Chemical analyses have also identified linolenic acid within the plant's lipid composition, compared with purslane, lamb's quarters, or broadleaf plantain. The evidence for ALA in cleavers is not as strong, so it would not be reasonable to call it one of the leading omega-3 sources on this list. But that does not make it irrelevant. On the contrary, cleavers represents a group of plants that are extremely easy to overlook. Plants that may not be nutritional superstars, but that can still contribute a useful mixture of fatty acids and plant compounds in a seasonal food requiring virtually no cultivation. The age of the plant matters more than the quantity. Young cleavers is softer and easier to handle, while later in the season the stems become rougher, the clinging structures become more pronounced, and the plant becomes much less appealing as food. That is why people familiar with the plant tend to pay attention to the short window in early spring rather than waiting until the plant is mature and covered with burrs. One traditional method is to place the cleaned young growth in cold water, allow it to infuse, and strain it before use. Cleavers does not need to become a vegetable. You force yourself to eat in large quantities to prove that it has value. What makes it memorable is something else. We have helped this plant travel on our clothing for thousands of years, yet we have almost completely forgotten that earlier generations found reasons to harvest it. Number 12, mallow. The value of a plant often changes with circumstances. In a garden full of vegetables, mallow may look like nothing more than a plant growing in the wrong place. But throughout history, when drought arrived, soils became poor, or food supplies became scarce, the ability to survive under difficult conditions transformed mallow into something worth keeping. The plant appears repeatedly in accounts of traditional food and periods of food shortage. In Mediterranean regions, mallow is still more likely to be recognized as a vegetable than as something completely foreign to the table. What is notable is that mallow's value does not simply come from providing something to eat. In the lipid portion of the leaves, ALA can represent a large share of the fatty acid composition. That means that although the leaf itself is not high in oil, the small amount of fat it does contain can lean strongly toward plant-based omega-3. Mallow also has a feature that almost no other plant on this list possesses to the same degree: naturally occurring mucilage in the leaves. When cooked, the leaves can develop a slightly slippery, thickening texture. For someone unfamiliar with it, that can seem like a disadvantage. But in soups and stews, the same property can help create body and softness. These mucilaginous compounds also help explain why mallow has such a long history in traditional uses involving sensitive tissues of the digestive and respiratory systems. So mallow carries three stories at once: ALA in the lipid portion, mucilage in the structure of the leaf, and the ability to survive under difficult conditions when many other plants fail. Young leaves are usually the easiest part to use. They can be added to soups or cooked with other vegetables, while the small, round, immature fruits of some mallow species also have a history of being eaten. Perhaps the most important thing to remember about number 12 is this. A food that helped people during difficult periods can become an unnecessary weed only when we have enough other options to forget why it once mattered. The plant did not lose its value. Human circumstances changed. Number 11, white clover. White clover can make us reconsider not only one weed, but the entire way a modern lawn is designed. Many people want a lawn made up of nothing but one uniform green grass. When the three-part leaves of clover appear, they interrupt that picture and are often removed. But white clover is a legume, and the most interesting part of its story begins below the soil. At its roots, clover lives in partnership with bacteria capable of fixing nitrogen. Through that relationship, the plant can contribute nitrogen to the system instead of depending entirely on fertilizer supply from outside. And here's the paradox. On some lawns, people remove clover because it does not belong, and then add nitrogen fertilizer afterward to maintain the green color of the very lawn from which the clover was removed. But white clover's story does not stop underground. The leaves above the soil are also interesting. In the lipid profile of the leaves and stems of Time's trifolium repens, linolenic acid has been identified as a prominent free fatty acid. So the green portion above ground also contributes to the story of plant-based omega-3, even though the total amount of oil in the leaves remains low, as it does in most leafy vegetables. This is important when talking about the nutrition of wild greens. We should not expect a handful of clover leaves to provide ALA as concentrated as flaxseed oil. They are completely different types of food. Clover's value lies in a whole green food package containing ALA, fiber, and many other components rather than a spoonful of concentrated oil. Young white clover leaves and flowers have been used as food, but this plant carries a practical warning that matters more than with many others on the list. Lawns are among the areas around a home most likely to be treated with herbicides, insecticides, and landscaping chemicals. A perfectly identified plant growing on recently sprayed ground is still not something that belongs in the kitchen. So white clover raises a bigger question than simply whether it is edible. Sometimes we need to consider both the plant and the system around it, what the plant is doing for the soil, what its leaves contain, and what we have done to the place where it is growing. Number 10, wood sorrel. Before people could buy lemons year-round at the supermarket, sour flavor still mattered in the kitchen. Wood sorrel provided exactly that. Its small leaves are often divided into 3 heart-shaped leaflets, and when the correctly identified edible plant is tasted, the flavor appears almost immediately. Bright, sharp, and noticeably lemon-like. For centuries, naturally, sour plants were used to make sauces, balance dishes, or add acidity to fish and meat. Wood sorrel, therefore, makes more sense as a seasoning herb than as a large bowl of greens. But taste reveals only half the story. In certain edible oxalis species that have been analyzed, ALA makes up a very significant portion of the fatty acid profile of the leaves. That shows that these small plants, usually remembered only for their sour flavor, also have a nutritional side directly related to plant-based omega-3. However, this is also a plant where numbers must be used carefully. Wood sorrel does not refer to only one species. The genus Oxalis contains many species, so the composition of one cannot automatically be applied to every sour 3-leaved oxalis growing in a lawn. In addition, the characteristic sourness comes from oxalic acid. That means wood sorrel is not suited to being turned into a vegetable that you eat in large amounts every day, especially for people who have been advised to limit oxalates. A more sensible approach is to let the plant do what its flavor is naturally best suited to doing. A few leaves chopped into a salad, a little in a sauce, or a small amount alongside fish or vegetables that benefit from a touch of acidity. At number 10, we encounter another lesson. A food does not need to occupy half the plate in order to be useful. Sometimes only a few leaves are enough to fulfill its role. Number 9, shepherd's purse. Shepherd's purse almost writes its own name on its stem. When the plant begins producing seed pods, small, flat structures shaped somewhat like hearts appear all along the stalk. Europeans in earlier times thought they resembled the little leather purses carried by shepherds, and the name shepherd's purse remained. Once you recognize that feature, you may begin seeing the plant in many places: garden edges, recently disturbed soil, roadside gaps, or neglected corners. What makes the plant special is not simply how common it is. Shepherd's purse has a very long history in European and Asian traditions of plant use, and it has appeared in herbal and medicinal records across many periods. For our subject, its ALA content provides the important connection. Alpha-linolenic acid has been identified within the lipid profile of shepherd's purse alongside many other plant compounds. But instead of looking at ALA as an isolated number, pay attention to the botanical family of the plant. Shepherd's purse belongs to the mustard family, the same large family that includes mustard, cabbage, kale, and many vegetables we buy every week. That helps explain why the young leaves and seed pods can carry a mild peppery flavor closer to mustard or watercress than to a bland lawnweed. And this is where harvest timing becomes critical. Before the plant strongly elongates and produces large numbers of pods, the young leaves are usually softer, milder, and more suitable for salads, soups, egg dishes, or stir fries. Once the plant matures, both texture and flavor change quickly. You could say shepherd's purse is a plant of the right moment. You may identify the correct species, but if you wait too long, the eating experience can be completely different. That is something grocery stores often hide from us because vegetables have already been harvested at the right stage before they reach the shelf. With wild greens, you have to learn the timing yourself. Number 8, common sow thistle. Sometimes the only thing preventing a plant from ever reaching the dinner table is its name. Thistle suggests something prickly, rough, and unfriendly. So when people hear the name common sow thistle, many may immediately decide that it cannot possibly be food. But Sonchus oleraceus has a well-established history as an edible wild green, especially in Mediterranean regions where foraged vegetables still hold a stronger place in food culture. More importantly for today's topic, young sow thistle leaves contain ALA, and alpha-linolenic acid can represent a prominent part of the leaf's fatty acid profile. This helps explain something often overlooked when we talk about omega-3. Not every source of ALA has to be oily. Seeds and plant oils may provide much more concentrated amounts of ALA, while green leaves play a completely different role, low total lipid, but that small lipid fraction may be rich in unsaturated fatty acids alongside water, fiber, minerals, and other plant compounds. Sow thistle fits that model very well. But the plant has a fairly clear window of use. Young leaves are softer and less bitter. As the plant matures, the texture becomes rougher and the bitterness increases substantially. So harvesting an old plant and deciding that sow thistle tastes terrible is a little like judging all lettuce by a plant that is already bolted. Young leaves can be blanched, sautéed, or cooked with milder greens to balance the flavor. Common sow thistle does not need a dramatic history or an enormous number to become interesting. It only has to show us that a name can create such a strong prejudice that people reject a food before they really understand what it is. Number 7, chickweed. Chickweed has an advantage that very few plants on this list can match. It appears at exactly the right time. During the height of summer, another small green plant might not attract much attention. But from late autumn through cooler periods and into early spring in suitable climates, many garden beds become sparse while chickweed can cover them in soft green mats. That timing alone makes the plant more valuable. Not because chickweed contains a nutrient that no other plant has, but because it provides fresh leaves when the number of choices coming from the garden begins to decline. In young thyme, Stellaria media thyme's leaves, ALA is an important component of the fatty acid fraction. At the same time, the plant provides vitamins and minerals typical of leafy greens. So chickweed does more than fill a seasonal gap. It also brings plant-based omega-3 into exactly the part of the year when many people may already be relying more heavily on stored and preserved foods. Interestingly, chickweed does not have the appearance or flavor that forces a beginner to overcome some major obstacle. It does not sting like nettle, it is not strongly bitter like dandelion, and it does not have the pronounced sourness of wood sorrel. Young growing tips usually have a mild, fresh flavor and can be added to salads or cooked dishes. As the stems get older, they can become stringier, so the actively growing tips are usually the better choice. Under suitable conditions, chickweed can also branch again after the tips are cut, meaning careful harvesting does not necessarily destroy an entire patch immediately. The strength of chickweed does not lie in one enormous nutritional number. It lies in timing. A fresh green that appears when the garden seems to be resting may be more valuable than a so-called nutrient-dense food that appears only when every other option is abundant too. Number 6, wild amaranth. Wild amaranth forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. What really turns a plant into a crop? Amaranth has been connected with human food in the Americas for a very long time. The seeds were harvested, the leaves were used as vegetables, and some forms of amaranth held important roles in the lives of indigenous civilizations. But when a wild relative appears among tomatoes or corn today, the usual reaction is to pull it before it can set seed. Biologically, the plant does not care whether it was planted in a row or germinated on its own. Nutritionally, it does not care either. Young wild amaranth leaves contain ALA, but what distinguishes the plant from wild greens, discussed only for omega-3, is its broader nutritional profile. Amaranth has long attracted attention for protein, amino acids, and minerals alongside the lipid portion of the leaves. So if purslane later represents a plant especially notable for ALA, wild amaranth represents a different idea. Overall nutritional density, omega-3 does not need to stand alone. A vegetable can be valuable because it provides ALA alongside protein and other nutrients in the same leaves. This is also a plant that can genuinely function as a cooked green rather than merely as a wild seasoning. When young, the leaves are softer, relatively mild, and can be blanched, sautéed, or added to soups. As the plant grows, both stems and leaves become more fibrous, while its ability to produce huge numbers of seeds gives gardeners a legitimate reason to keep it under control. But control and waste are not the same thing. You do not have to allow wild amaranth to seed itself throughout the entire garden in order to recognize that the young leaves you are removing can still be food. That is the fascinating boundary represented by number 6. The same plant family, the same leaves, but simply changing where they grow completely changes what we call them. Number 5, stinging nettle. If there's one plant on this list where knowledge matters more than courage, it is stinging nettle. You do not need to prove anything by touching it with bare hands. Tiny structures on the leaves and stems can cause a distinctly unpleasant stinging and burning sensation. That effective defense mechanism is exactly why many people learn from an early age to avoid nettle altogether. But humans also learn something else. The sting does not remain once the plant is handled correctly. Heat can neutralize the stinging structures, and after blanching or proper cooking, nettle changes from a plant you do not want to touch into a vegetable that can be used in soups, stews, egg dishes, or green sauces. Nutritionally, nettle is not interesting only because of ALA. The leaves also provide iron, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and other micronutrients. That combination creates a broader nutritional package than focusing on a single fatty acid alone. Within the lipid portion of the leaf, alpha-linolenic acid is an important fatty acid, but the ALA arrives within a food structure that also contains minerals, pigments, protein, and fiber. That is how humans historically consumed nettle, as a whole vegetable, not as an isolated nutrient supplement. The most suitable part is usually the young spring growth before the plant becomes old and advances too far into reproduction. Wear gloves while harvesting, then blanch or cook thoroughly before eating. Nettle therefore has a completely different motif from the previous plants. It is not overlooked because it is too ordinary. It is overlooked because the plant actively tells us to stay away. And when knowledge of how to process it disappears, a food used for generations can easily become something remembered only for the pain it causes when touched. Number 4, dandelion. Dandelion may be the only plant on this list that many people are willing to pay money simply not to see. Herbicides, root removal tools, and lawn care services are all sold with one familiar goal: remove those yellow flowers from the lawn. That becomes rather interesting when you remember that humans have used dandelion leaves, flowers, and roots for a long time. But dandelion should be understood differently from purslane. Its omega-3 content in the leaves is not as striking as the strongest plants near the end of this list. Part of dandelion's interest also lies in the inulin found in the root and the naturally bitter compounds in the leaves, features associated with the digestive system and the way the body handles a meal. At the same time, young leaves still contain ALA as part of their fatty acid composition. So dandelion's value does not depend on one huge omega-3 number. It lies in the combination of some ALA from the leaves, prebiotic fiber from the roots, and the bitter compounds that have made the plant part of long traditions of eating bitter greens. That bitterness also explains why many first-time tasters dislike dandelion. If you pick a mature leaf in the middle of the season and eat it raw, you are trying the plant when its flavor's at its strongest. Young leaves earlier in the season are usually milder. Larger leaves can be sautéed with olive oil and garlic, cooked with beans, or mixed with milder greens. The goal does not have to be to remove every trace of bitterness. In many cuisines, bitterness is deliberately balanced rather than eliminated. Dandelion therefore does not stand at number 4 because it has the 4th highest level of ALA. This countdown is not a laboratory ranking. It stands here because almost no plant demonstrates the cultural paradox more clearly. A plant with a long history as food, growing freely in the yard, yet supporting an entire market of products designed to destroy it. Number 3, broadleaf plantain. Broadleaf plantain does not choose the most comfortable places in the garden. Instead, it commonly appears where the soil is compacted by footsteps, along pathways, around frequently used parts of the yard, or in places that are rarely loosened and cared for, like a vegetable bed. For most crops, those conditions are far from ideal. Yet Plantago major is adapted well enough to maintain a low rosette of leaves close to the ground, continuing to grow despite constant pressure from the activity around it. That ability is one reason people often regard it as a stubborn weed. But when you look at the leaf instead of the place where it grows, the story changes. Analyses of broadleaf plantain's fatty acid composition show that ALA can make up a significant portion of the lipid fraction of the leaf. It is a clear example of the principle mentioned at the beginning of the video. The leaf is not an oily food, but within the small amount of fat it contains, plant-based omega-3 can occupy a prominent position. What makes plantain particularly interesting is that it does not require a distant historical story to surprise us. The surprise is in the distance between us and the plant. You may step on it every time you walk from the back door to the garden. It may grow along the edge of a path where you have pulled it dozens of times. And because it thrives in compacted soil, we are more likely to associate it with poor ground than with food. When it comes to using it, the age of the leaf determines almost everything. Young leaves are softer and easier to chop. As the leaves mature, the strong parallel veins become noticeably tougher, so larger leaves are better cooked and cut across the veins rather than eaten whole. Plantain also provides an interesting ecological lesson. A plant that can survive where it is not cared for is not necessarily poor in value. Sometimes its tolerance of compacted soil and human activity is precisely what allows it to remain close enough for us to see every day. The problem is that we rarely look down. Number 2, lamb's quarters. Imagine a vegetable bed with 2 plants growing side by side. One is spinach, grown from a packet of seed you purchased, planted neatly in a row, and watered carefully. The other is lamb's quarters, which germinated on its own from the soil without being invited. By ordinary gardening instinct, we protect the first plant and pull out the second. But if we go back several thousand years, that distinction becomes much less obvious. Plants in the Chenopodium Times group have been used as food in North America for a very long time. Leaves were gathered as greens, while seeds also played a role in the diets of indigenous communities. Lamb's quarters itself did not suddenly become inedible when new cultivated vegetables became more common. What changed was human agricultural culture. Nutritionally, lamb's quarters leaves contain ALA alongside protein, calcium, and other minerals. It is one of the plants on this list where the omega-3 story does not stand alone. It sits within a fairly broad nutritional profile belonging to a wild green that was genuinely used as food. That makes the decision to pull lamb's quarters from a vegetable bed much more interesting. We are not necessarily removing it because it is nutritionally poor. We are removing it because we have reserved that space for something else. That is a very important distinction. Young leaves usually have a relatively mild flavor, slightly earthy, and much more familiar than many other wild greens. They can be quickly cooked, sautéed with olive oil and garlic, or added to soups. As the leaves age, the texture becomes rougher and the flavor stronger. The light whitish coating on young leaves is one useful identifying feature, but no wild plant should ever be identified by a single trait alone. Correct identification must come before preparation. One plant is sown, so it is cared for. The other grows by itself, so it is pulled. Sometimes the difference is not in the leaf, it is in the gardener's plan. Number 1, purslane. And number 1 brings us back to the very question that drew nutrition researchers toward wild greens decades ago. In the early 1990s, while Artemis Simopoulos was studying the diets of Greek communities, an intriguing detail emerged. Some populations showed notable omega-3 status, even though the amount of fish they ate did not always seem high enough to explain the entire picture. One of the foods that attracted attention was purslane, not an exotic fruit, not a supplement, but a low-growing plant with slightly reddish stems and small, thick, succulent leaves, the same kind of plant many gardeners elsewhere pull immediately when they see it spreading between vegetable rows. In many parts of the Mediterranean, people did not eat purslane because a nutrition expert had recently announced that it was a superfood. They ate it because it was simply food. It went into salads, it was cooked in meals, it was combined with olive oil, lemon, yogurt, an ordinary habit. And that ordinary habit helped make purslane one of the best-known leafy vegetables when the subject is ALA. Analyses have reported that fresh purslane can provide hundreds of milligrams of alpha-linolenic acid per 100 grams of leaves. For a fresh leafy vegetable, that is a notable amount. But what makes purslane special is not only the number, it is also easy to eat. It is not strongly bitter like dandelion. It does not sting like nettle. It is not restricted to a few leaves at a time like wood sorrel. Purslane leaves are succulent. They have a pleasant crunch. The flavor is lightly sour and fresh. That means the plant can genuinely function as a vegetable in a meal rather than merely as a seasoning. In many Mediterranean preparations, the method is extremely simple. Fresh purslane, olive oil, lemon, and a little salt. It can also be combined with tomatoes, cucumbers, or yogurt. If added to a hot dish, putting it in near the end of cooking helps preserve the texture and avoids exposing its polyunsaturated fatty acids to heat for longer than necessary. Purslane also contains oxalates, so people who have been advised to limit oxalate intake should consider the amount they use. And as with every wild plant in this video, anything growing in chemically treated ground should not be harvested simply because you recognize it. But even after all those cautions, the paradox of purslane remains powerful. A plant that does not need to be sown can appear on its own in garden soil. A plant with a flavor pleasant enough to become a real vegetable, a notable amount of ALA for a leafy green. A plant that has been eaten by many communities for generations. And yet, in countless other gardens, it is still pulled up and thrown onto the compost pile before the gardener even knows its name. That is why purslane deserves to stand at number 1. Not because it is a miracle food and not because it can replace every other source of omega-3. It stands here because no other plant captures the paradox of this list more clearly. What one culture considers an ordinary vegetable may be exactly what another culture spends the entire summer trying to remove. After going through these 15 plants, perhaps the most important thing to remember is not one particular ALA number. What matters more is the way we decide what deserves to be called food. A plant sown in a row usually receives water, fertilizer, and protection. But another plant that appears only a few centimeters away on its own may be pulled immediately, even if earlier generations once used it as food. That does not mean every weed in the yard belongs in the kitchen. Absolutely not. Correct identification must always come first. Plants growing on treated ground, beside polluted roads, or in soil with an unknown history should not be harvested either. And the omega-3 in most of these plants is primarily ALA, not a direct replacement for EPA and DHA from other sources. But if today's video changes one thing, perhaps it only needs to change the few seconds before you pull a plant. Instead of throwing it away immediately, take a moment to find out what it is. It may truly be nothing more than a weed you do not want in the garden. But it may also be a food that humans once knew very well, and that we have simply forgotten the name of. If you enjoy stories like this, follow the channel and like the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.